What's up, everybody? It's Patrick with Gateway Worship. Well, today I wanted to bring to you a video that's going to give an inside look at one of our post-production mixes for one of our live services. I'm going to walk through one of the Pro Tools sessions that I've used to mix one of the songs, and hopefully there's something that you can glean from it, that you can learn from it, and bring into your own mixes. Let's go ahead and dive in now. All right, well, here's a little bit of a look inside of my Pro Tools session. You can see that I have the video all synced up so we can watch along, and I'm gonna just go ahead and play just a little piece of this so we can get an idea of what we're listening to. So as you can probably tell, it was a super powerful moment in worship. In the room, it was just incredible to hear all of those different people singing together from all the different countries and languages. And so my goal as a mix engineer is really to make this moment translate as best I can for an online audience or for any of the times it will be viewed after the service. So I'm gonna go ahead and show you probably where I do my most heavy-handed type of EQ and compression, and that's on my 2-bus. I'm a big fan of broad strokes on my 2-bus with bus compression and bus EQ. And so let me go ahead and show you what I'm doing there first. So first off the bat, I have API 2500, using that to do some compression and really just add such a vibe, such a sound to my bus right off the top. So you can see I have that threshold set to soft, the knee, and the detector set to medium. The tone is set on new. So those are just the settings that I have found to be the most universally great right off the bat. So sometimes I'll mess around with those tone a little bit depending on what song I'm mixing, but for the most part, that's where it stays. Next up, I have the Brainworx Townhouse bus compressor. I love this thing. This thing is great. Again, overall bus compressor that's just adding a lot of mojo, a lot of vibe. I'm using it for a little bit of makeup gain as well, as you can see, as what I was doing on the 2500 as well. And so this is just, again, a light ratio threshold. I'm only kicking it probably 2 to 3 decibels of compression, not getting anything crazy, but this just adds a lot of glue to my 2-bus. Next up, I have the Mog EQ, another great plugin by Plugin Alliance. What I'm really using this to do, again, is just broad stroke type of EQ. So I have about 1.5 decibels painted in with the sub frequency. I have about 1 decibel painted in at 40 hertz, taken out a little bit at 160, 650 I'm keeping just flat, keeping even. At 2.5, I have a little bump, about 0.5 decibel there. And then this air band, this is kind of the magic of this Mog EQ plugin, is the air band. And so I have it set at the 20K shelf, and then I'm giving it about 4 decibels of air of gain on that. So you can go up to the 40K, that even adds like another level of air that is actually technically beyond human hearing, but however it will affect all the harmonics below 40K. It's just a very musical EQ. I really love this thing on the 2-bus. All right, so next up I have the Sooth plugin by Oak Sound. Love this plugin. It really just is providing a little bit of dynamic EQ in a way. To be honest with you, there is some things that it's doing in the background that I'm not entirely sure of what it's doing, but what it does is very musical and really, really great. So I have that just on my top end, just kind of preventing me from getting too harsh, too shiny on top, unnecessarily so. So I'm using that to help me out with some of those top end transients and whatnot that might be peeking through. Next up, from Ozone, I'm actually using their multi-pressor, dynamic multi-pressor, and I'm just using that again to kind of knock down just a dB, if even that, on some of these different bands. Specifically this low band, that 140 and below, I'm really trying to make sure that I catch some of those little peaks that might be trying to stick through, and then as well as the middle and the high band. So I'm doing just a little bit of multi-band compression to make sure that I don't have anything jumping out at me. And then lastly, in my 2-bus is I have the BX Master Desk, Brainworx Master Desk. So this thing is just so cool. It's got so much vibe, so much sound saturation to it. I'm using this as a limiter. I'm using this for just a little bit of tone shaping, nothing crazy, and then also a little bit of stereo enhancing. You can see there, so about 35%. So this is a fantastic plugin. I would definitely recommend digging in on this one if you have the chance and resource to be able to get that. It can take a mix just from good to great. So it really can do a fantastic job. So I will point out here on my master bus is I have a plugin that's just a metering plugin, and it's called AB Metric by Adapter Audio Systems. And what I use this for is really just to A/B different songs that I'm potentially listening to that I want to reference. What this plugin will also do is give you a great spectrum analyzer as well as just a loudness meter. And you can see how your song is competing with other songs. You can see if it's actually getting squashed, if it's getting compressed too much or limited too much. It'll give you a really great reading on here. So I highly recommend this plugin. It's really good to be able to A/B other songs, but also your own mixes. Like for instance, with these live mixes, is I'm constantly going back and trying to reference my old mixes so that I'm kind of staying within the same sonic range. Obviously, with every mix, I want to get better and I want my craft to enhance, but I don't want there to be a drastic difference between mixes as best I can. And then last up, you'll see I have the Sonarworks plugin. I use this personally for just some things in my room that aren't necessarily perfectly treated here. It helps correct a little bit of that, so I have that bypassed for right now so that you guys are not hearing that out on your mix right now. Well, let's go ahead and solo in on some of the drums. Let's start there. I'm just going to solo out the drums and let's take a listen here for a minute. So just a super fun drum part right here. Just big cymbals, big hits. Really, really love this part. Let's go ahead and take a look a little bit at what I'm doing on some of the individual channels here. You'll notice that I use a plugin very consistently across a lot of my channels that need some sort of phase alignment. I use this plugin called Auto Align. And what this does is it basically does phase alignment, and it won't just do 180 degrees phase flip. It'll do samples. So it can do smaller increments and be able to get closer to what is technically completely in phase. So love this plugin. It really is a lifesaver when you're having to do some of these drum mixes and mixes of live scenarios where they probably didn't get out the measuring tape and try to make sure that things are actually all completely lined up with the snare drum and whatnot. Next up, you're going to see this plugin on a lot of things on my session here. It's the Brainworx Ssl 4K emulation. It is fantastic. I love it. I've used the SSL Waves plugin as well. It really, I think this one is even another step above, another notch above than that one. It just really, the EQ is incredible. I use the gate all the time on drums. I'm using compression all the time on different things. And so it just is it's really a one channel stop, like a one-stop shop, where you can get some just great sounds immediately. So you'll see that on kick drum, I'm using it just for a little bit of EQ, kind of boosting that low end a little bit, and then cutting out some of that boxiness that typically happens in that mid-range. And then just doing some compression, and then obviously some gate as well. So following up that BX SSL 4K, I have this Spl Attacker. What this is doing is kind of a transient designer that just gives like some attack, some front end to the kick drum that I'm looking. So not a lot of controls there to mess with, but this is a mighty little powerful plugin to use on drums specifically. All right, well next up I'm using a kick trigger to supplement with the live kick drum. I'm using the Spl Drum Exchanger in order to do that on this particular drum. I'm using the Thudwig That Sound drum sample in order to get that sound that I'm looking for. I love this Drum Exchanger plugin. It gives some cool options for the way to tune it, the way that you want the sample to sustain or the attack. You can actually kind of manipulate the sample even after the sample has been, you know, created and in its perfect state. So again, followed up that with a SSL 4K, similar type of moves there. It's a sample, so there's not a lot of EQ that I need to do, but I did take out a little bit of attack there since my kick in is providing most of the attack sound that I'm looking for. After that, I am using a Purple Audio MC477, excuse me. And again, this is just a great compressor, kind of 1176 type of vibe, and gives me just some extra compression, some smack to my kick drum that I'm looking for. Followed up lastly in that chain is the Sooth plugin again. I'm using that just to maybe take down a little bit of that harshness that I might be hearing, and just maybe to control some of those top end transients. All right, well, next up I have my snare top. Again, I'm using the Auto Align plugin to make sure phase alignment is great. I'm using that SSL 4K, taking out some of that boxiness with the EQ in the mid-range, bumping up a little bit around 108, 100 hertz, somewhere in there to kind of give some of that body. Following up with the Lindell 6X500 series. This is like a really cool preamp plugin. I just came across this just a few weeks ago and have been using it ever since. It gives you the option to do a little bit of a high boost, kind of like some shelf EQ on there, but it really is functioning kind of like as a saturation plugin, so a preamp saturation plugin. Following up that, I have the Lindell 7X, which is a compression plugin, using that for some great compression. Sounds really, really nice on that particular drum. All right, well, with the live snare drum, I am supplementing with a couple triggers. Again, I'm using the Spl Drum Exchanger for that. I have the Smack Beauty That Sound drum sample in there. Love that drum sample. I think it sounds so great. As well as I'm using the Dumpster drum sample from That Sound to supplement kind of some of that low-end beef that I'm looking for from the drum. So let's go ahead and just solo out the kick drum along with the snare drum, just to give you an idea what those sound like together. So that's kind of what they sound like when they're soloed out. Let's go ahead and add in a couple other things here. So let's go ahead and add in my overheads, which again, I am doing a Brainworx Ssl 4K on those, doing a little bit of compression, a little bit of EQ, again, trying to take out some of that boxiness, and a little bit of high pass so I can get some of that low end kick out of my overheads. Let's take a listen to that real quick. All right, well, next up I want to show you what I'm doing with the toms. I am using a trigger for the toms in order to get some of those big tom sounds. So I'm using actually the Steven Slate trigger for this particular drum for the toms. I find that for whatever reason, the trigger, Steven Slate's trigger, can pick up some of those tom intricacies a little bit more than the Spl Drum Exchanger. So it really does a fantastic job. So I'm using that with the 1985 drum sample from That Sound. I'm using tom 4 for the floor tom, tom 2 for the rack tom. Followed up again using the Brainworx Ssl 4K. They're samples again, so you don't need to do a whole lot of EQ on them, but I do have a little bit of compression going, just a little bit of EQ, a little bit of top end shine that I'm putting on those guys. So let's go ahead and check out some of these buses that I'm adding in with my drum. So I have a drum smash going, and what that is I send my kick and my snare drum, as well as my toms, to a bus called Drum Smash. And what I'm doing on that particular bus is I have this Brainworx Townhouse bus compressor, and I'm just really using a lot of compression. So kicking by probably, more than 8 decibels of compression. So let's take a look. One of my other buses that I'm using is a big drum verb, and that is I'm using a Brainworx reverb for that, just trying to get the drums to feel a little bit more like they're in the space, like they're in the actual auditorium. And so this gives me just again a little bit more of that room, more of that space, kind of that breathability that the drums need. When so many of the drums are close mic'd, you need some of that bigness of room sounds. So again, let's go ahead and just listen to this drum only mix. I'm gonna add in this time, I'm gonna add in the audience mics as well, because for me, the audience mics is such a big part of my drum sound. So I kind of want to add those in together. Before I do that, let me just point out real quick, on my actual drum bus, where I have all of my drums being sent to, is I have, again, a Brainworx Townhouse compressor doing probably about 2 to 3 decibels of gain reduction there, followed up with the Oak Sound Soothe 2. Again, just trying to take off some of those harsh transients that might be popping through that might be unmusical and something we don't want to hear. So let's listen to the drums soloed out with the audience mics now. So you can really hear how that is really brings the drums to life, having all those drums in the audience mics and pumping those audience mics into the mix really just makes things come alive, in my opinion. All right, well, next up we have the bass. Let's just go ahead and take a little listen to that by itself. Let's do this. All right. So he does have a bass DI clean line, as well as a dirty line and a bass amp. So I'm kind of using a blend of all 3 of those together to get kind of my bass sound. So you'll see up here, again, I'm using that auto align plugin to make sure that that is in line with the bass amp signal that I'm getting. And then I'm just using a Brainworx Ssl 4K. I'm doing a little bit of compression, but not much. You can see I'm really not doing hardly any EQ to his dirty sound there. Bass clean, I'm doing a little bit more EQ when it comes to that, adding in some of that low there, some of that 47 hertz, 50 hertz down sub frequencies. And then on the actual bass amp, doing a little bit of EQ there, as well as some light compression. So, but nothing too heavy-handed. All right, you'll see on my bass bus that I'm using a plugin called the BX Subsynth, again by Plugin Alliance. This is like a really cool plugin that adds just some of those sub-harmonics that you might be looking for from a bass that weren't necessarily given in the actual performance, but you want to add into the mix later that kind of provides some of that, 60 hertz and lower kind of vibe, some frequencies down there that really give you, it's more felt than heard. You can put it that way. Really like this plugin, but you just gotta kind of use it. You can dash it in a little bit, so you don't want to get carried away with this one. Again, on the bus, I have the Brainworx Townhouse plugin, doing a little bit of compression, and then again followed up by the Oak Sound Soothe. Just trying to do a little bit of some of that dynamic EQing to help get some of those bass peaks that might be hitting me at certain notes. Let's go ahead and listen in context with the bass and drums together, along with the audience mics. So here's what that sounds like. Those are sounding great. Well, let's go ahead and pop over to the keys. You can see here again, have hardly anything going on the keys. When it comes to keys and guitars, you know, they typically have crafted their sound in such a way that they don't need a whole lot of heavy-handed EQ or compression. Now, just a little bit will obviously be helpful, but when it comes to guitars and keys, I'm typically, I let them go pretty unscathed, if you will, from EQ or compression. So here on my piano and my pads, I just have the Brainworx Ssl 4K, providing just a little bit of EQ in some maybe treble areas, and as well as a high pass filter, and just a slight bit of compression. Let's go ahead and listen to that solo it out. All right, well, next up, let's go ahead and just take a little look at the Ableton tracks. Again, not really doing any compression, nothing EQ-wise on those, letting those live because those stems sound great already. Let's pop over to these audience microphones. So audience is such a big part of, obviously, a live sound, and so you want to make sure that you treat these audience mics well in a way that allows you to push them into the mix in a really nice, healthy manner. So you can see that I have, again, I'm using the Auto Align plugin in order to get maybe some phase alignment issues that may happen just from the placement of those particular microphones. We have 6 different audience microphones that we use in our auditorium on a regular basis. For big live recordings, we might add some more, but on a regular weekend, we have 6. And those are 2 shotgun mics that are placed up at the front of the catwalk, kind of facing towards the audience. We have some mics in the very back of the auditorium, facing towards the middle of the auditorium. And then we have 2 microphones hanging over the middle of the auditorium, just pointing right straight down. So again, you'll see my Ssl 4K on all of these channels. Not really doing a whole lot other than just maybe a little bit of a high pass filter, maybe just the slightest bit of compression on those guys. And then on the audience bus, I am again using the Ssl 4K just to do a little bit more surgical EQ overall for the audience mics altogether. I will take out a lot of the low end just because it can sometimes get really muddy. And even though it initially sounds cool and it sounds really like something you would want to include in your mix, a lot of times it's hard to control in addition to what the bass is doing, in addition to what the kick drum is doing. And so typically I find myself rolling off a lot of that low end when it comes to the audience mics. And then last up, I have the Brainworx Townhouse compressor that really just allows me to have that glue that is needed to bring all of the audience mic sound together. Let's go ahead and take a little listen to just the audience by themselves. It's so cool to hear everybody singing along. That is a really special moment. All right, well, let's go ahead and take a look at the lead vocals. And I kind of have a general lead vocal chain that I start with on all my lead vocals for live scenarios. It starts off with the Waves de-esser, and I'm using that just to control some of the S's that might be popping through at the very initial start of the vocal chain. Next up, I have the Ozone 7 Dynamic EQ. Again, I'm trying to use this to grab some of those kind of unpleasant frequencies that might be trying to pop through before I get to my compressor, specifically around 300 hertz and then again around 3K. 300 is a lot of that kind of low breathy stuff that will happen whenever somebody gets too close to the microphone. And then 3K is just some of that harshness that might be trying to pop through, depending on the S's and just how much they're pronunciating in the particular song that they're singing. Next up, I have the Vox. I love this compressor. It's kind of one of those that you don't know all that's happening in the background, but what it does is really great. I think it's actually a mixture of a compressor and kind of a limiter a little bit. So you have to be careful. You don't want to get too heavy-handed with this. But I go ahead and try to get around maybe 3, maybe 6 decibels of compression, of gain reduction here happening with this particular plugin. It just immediately kind of brings the vocal front and center for us to mix. All right, next up, again, you'll see the SSL 4K, surprise, surprise, doing that with a little bit of EQ, a little bit of compression, high pass filtering, just some overall cleanup of the vocal. Next up, I have the CLA 1176 copy. Again, only using this for maybe 2, maybe 3 decibels of gain reduction, nothing crazy. But this plugin just adds a little bit of extra vibe, extra mojo, if you will, and is really great at controlling a lot of those transients that might be trying to pop through that are unsightly, unwelcome. And then lastly in my chain, I have the Soothe by Oak Sound plugin. Love this just to kind of control, again, anything that might be popping out from some of the compression that I have inserted into the chain. I'm trying to grab any of those unwanted frequencies that might be a little too harsh for what we're trying to go for. All right, for some of these effect sends I have going for lead vocals, I'm sending to a lead verb, a lead delay, and then what I call a big BGV verb or big BGV effects. And for my lead verb, I'm just using the Valhalla Vintage Verb 1980s sound. I really, really love this plugin. You'll see I use it on snare drum verb as well. It's just a really great plugin that you can pull up and it immediately sounds good. I like this 1980s color for this particular use, but the 1970s color is great. The now color is great. All of them just really have a really awesome sound that you can utilize in a lot of different scenarios. Followed up by the Vintage Verb is the Ozone 9. I'm using a little bit of it as a dynamic EQ, again, just to control some of that maybe vocal harshness that might be popping through on the EQ around 2.5K. All right, for my lead delay, I have the Brainworx Delay 2500. This is a fantastic delay. It's got a lot of options on it. Honestly, don't probably even utilize most of them, especially when it comes to this particular application. But it does have some of those mid-side options if you want to get into that particular thing. And then finally, I will just show you what I use for what I call a big BGV FX. Again, it's the 2500 Brainworx delay into the Valhalla Vintage Verb 1980s. And then finally, with a little bit of EQ, just rolling off some of that low end that isn't super applicable for that particular type of sound that I'm trying to go for. A last couple of effects that I will show you is just I have a big room verb that I will use. I'll occasionally send some instruments to in order to make them sound like they're a little bit more in the auditorium, in the space. Maybe they were a little bit too close mic'd and I'm not getting a lot of them in the actual PA in my audience mics, so I will send them to this big room verb that gives just a little bit of a hall long verb on that. As well as I have an audience verb, again, kind of faking a little bit of the audience verb sound. I will use this on maybe tracks, Ableton tracks occasionally, as well as other instruments that maybe just, again, weren't peeking through the PA as much as I would like them to. And then lastly, I use a channel every so often. I don't use it all the time, but on lead vocals, I will use what I call the wide Vox Aux channel. And it's the Brainworx Stereo Maker. And what I do is I just try to give that lead vocal a little bit of width. It kind of spreads out the vocal on far left, right, and I can just kind of blend that in to taste to maybe just give a little bit more wideness to that lead vocal. Well, that'll about do it for my In the Mix video for the song So Worthy. I hope that was helpful. I hope that there's some tips and some tricks that you can apply to your own mixes. Thank you again so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.